class and everyone else. In this video, I'm going to start a series on color theory. Specifically in this video, I'm going to talk about color theory and give an introduction. Now, I'm not going to talk about things like you might have learned in kindergarten, like primary colors and secondary colors. Instead, I want to demystify this process for you and go over content as usable for design. But what I'm going to try to do is I'm going to try to take the mystery out of it, pull back the curtain on Oz, if you will. It's not that complicated, although I would say the way traditional color theory is usually taught, they sort of give you some rules, expect you to follow it, but they don't necessarily explain where those rules came from, nor do they really say how to use those rules in sort of more complex fashion to create your own color palettes. I want to really give the content of why color theory works in this video. Now, as this note says here, it actually is just simple patterns. Now, I'm going to take several videos to cover all this content. Again, in this one, will be just an intro. I will get into how to use it for design and create your own color palettes moving on. And usually the way traditional color theory works is you start by picking one color. So for example, I might pick the color blue. And in this case, I'll just mark that off by putting this right on here, just like that. And then you often see what various other colors work with it. So once you've selected one color, you'll then see various other colors you can work with. For example, I'm going to show you this one. If I put a color over here, and I put a color over here, and finally a piece down in here. Okay, so this would be our standard tetradic color, or four colors being equal. And we can see when we do that, we can add a color palette right from there, just adding some tints and shades to these. Now, another thing that you'll see in color theory is that oftentimes when you have colors selected like this, they might draw a shape in between. So for example, I could draw a square between these four colors. Just like this. And this square starts to hint at this underlying pattern that I want to get to in the video. But for now, we'll just look at it like this. Now you could look at any color in a similar way. I started with blue in this case, but I could rotate the color wheel right around, and then I have red. So we can see that's the exact same shape. It's the exact same pattern, except this time I'm starting with red and getting completely different colors built out from it. Now, what I can also show is this. What I've done here is I've added a circle around the color wheel to show the underlying pattern more clearly. In this case, I have these arcs labeled A, and the reason why they're labeled A is because they are all the same length. And we intuitively know this, that around the color wheel, this color palette is equally spaced around the color wheel. And it is these patterns that I just applied here that is really going to help us understand true color theory. So let's take the next step in. And I've got to do some erasing. So this will be cut out. Now before I jump more into patterns, I just want to step back for a second and look at all the traditional harmony rules in color theory. And these are them listed on the screen. The first one, we have monochromatic, which essentially deals with one color. And we'll look more at that later on in this video when we get into tints and shades. So moving on, we have analogous. Again, I'm starting with red. And analogous simply is start with a color and pick two colors or more that are next to it or similar, analogous. Moving on, we have complementary, which is the opposite color on the color wheel. Split complementary down there, which is you take that complementary color and pull it apart ever so slightly, as you can see on the screen. Triadic with three colors. Tetradic that we just looked at, it's got four colors equally spaced. And then there are some variations on tetradic, so I've labeled them 2 and 3, which is this. Instead of squares, they're rectangles rotated one way or the other. Now I can fade these color wheels back, just get a sense of the specific colors that come out of them. But in this next animation here, we can see that each one of these, just like we just looked at, is actually a composite of simple patterns around the color wheel. Many of them are just equally spaced patterns like A and A, A and A. Some of them, though, have some B's like these tetradics, A, B, A, where B in these cases are slightly smaller than A. All right, so again, color theory, it's just patterns. Now, let's go back and take a look at how we can use these patterns on color theory. So I've already sort of overlaid a pattern on here, and I do just, again, want to mark this out, again, starting with red. So I'm going to throw this up here and put on this color down here and one down here. Okay? Now this is just a split complementary pattern from standard harmony rules. We can see that we have the pattern A and B because these two lengths are the same and this one is slightly smaller. All right. Now keep that pattern in mind because we're going to walk through a series of steps here. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to advance this one step. We notice my pattern changed. I just need to make some adjustments right here. I'm just sliding each of these patterns up one space, okay? So take this, I'm sliding this right up there. So I just pulled it apart. I got the same pattern, A, and B down here, except this time I've got the triadic pattern. The B is the same distance as A, but for consistency, showing you through these moves, I want to show you that it is really A, and B, even if sometimes they equal the same thing. Because what I can do is I can do this again. I can take the same pattern and just do one more step. So let's watch this. Just going to advance the drawing here, and then same thing, just slide up my markers to these colors, and I have my new palette here. Now, you notice in this case, this palette works quite nicely, but I labeled it new palette because there's nothing similar in traditional color harmony rules that accounts for this pattern. Yet, on the surface, we see two things. One, it's fundamentally the same A pattern that we've seen for the rest, meaning it should work. And two, we can look at the color palette itself. Hey, that wasn't supposed to happen. So the second thing we can see is that the color palette itself, it works quite nicely. Those are very nice colors that work together. And again, the reason why this works is because it's just about pattern. And you'll notice, even though there's just a handful of color harmony rules, if you look at many resources, you'll see there's much more than that, including one such as this. It's easy to explain when we see it through patterns. And, of course, we can keep going because we're not done yet. So I'll take one more step, and I'll slide up one more space on my colors there, and slide up one more space over here. Again, this is a new color palette. It's not specifically mentioned in traditional color harmony rules, but it works just as well, just as the last one does. And I can do the step again, and it's probably pretty obvious what happens is by the time I get here, just making the same steps up and up and up, all of a sudden now I'm at analogous, which is a standard harmony rule. Last time I think I showed it with only two A's at the top, but really it implies that there's a B along the bottom that in this case is longer than the two A's. Now, I can be a little bold, arguably, and I could really get monochromatic just by stepping each of these sides up one more and placing them on top of red. I might be off a little bit in space, but again, one step up, just like before, and all of a sudden monochromatic is just like the same patterns as before, although in this case, distance A is 0, and distance B is essentially all the way around the color wheel. And if I were to actually step all the way back based on that same thing, because I didn't start with this, but I actually could have started with complementary and just had them all moved down, all the way slid back down to the bottom, just like this. And what I've done is I've created almost all the traditional color wheels just by looking at simple patterns and sliding these markers up the wheel. So let me take these off for a second and look at it again in a couple different ways just to hammer home this point. Now, we can look at this concept with this animation here, and so we can see each one we just looked at. We start with complementary, we step up each way on each side each time, maintaining the A pattern, and we can see each of the standard harmony rules falls right out of it. They're all related, they're all very similar. Here I have each of the patterns pulled out independently from each other. Now, one of the things we can note when I have this series moving on is that many of these are in our traditional color theory. We can see they just blinked up here on the screen. And as I mentioned before, a couple new patterns fall right out of it, but they fill in the sequence and relate all to the next. Now, the ones that are missing here are ones with 4 colors, but we can do the exact same thing to them. And I'm just going to jump ahead and show you them all aligned together. Again, starting with monochromatic, we can move around adding up to 4 colors and see how they all relate to each other in terms of pattern. The second one from monochromatic is complementary. And we'll notice that all of these will have cyan in them as the complementary color. If we look down to the bottom right, we see tetradic 1, which was the square we looked at the beginning of this video. All are spaced equally. They're all A apart. We also have the triadic 2 and triadic 3, which are just rectangles rotated one way or the other. New tetradic A, new tetradic B. They're just like the other rectangles, they're just a little skinnier. Fundamentally, they meet the same A, B pattern. And that's what it's all about. It's about pattern. So let's take a look at this. So I can start again by placing a marker on red, just like before. Okay, and this time I'm actually going to place a marker slightly offset. I'm going to put one on blue, and I'm going to put one on green, which we have seen, and then I'm going to put one on magenta. And we see in this case what we have, instead of an A, B pattern, we have an A, B pattern. And the other thing I can do, not that it's required, but I can also draw on the new shape. In this case, it's going to create a diamond shape rather than a square. But it still has a pattern to it. And you won't find this in traditional color theory. Now let's go back and talk about monochromatic for a second. Up to this point, I've only been talking about basic hues. But to really do monochromatic, you need to go over tints and shades, which is really just adding blacks and whites to it. Or if you're in computer language, you might be talking about saturation and brightness or value. So a tint is really just adding white to the diagram. In this animation, you can see each of the hues now goes from the pure hue to one side to pure white on the other. And I can independently look at shades, which is adding black. In this case, the diagram goes towards black as it goes towards the center of the screen. Of course, it becomes most helpful when you add both tints and shades together. So now we can see in this color wheel, each segment of hue has the pure hue in one corner, pure white in the other, and it goes towards black or towards gray as you get towards the center, and there's many variations all in between. When I have that, this is where I can really work with monochromatic. So I can pick a few colors on it and create a color palette out of this. Now the one thing I do want to point out is that because I have hues, tints, and shades, what I have here is really a three-dimensional drawing, right? One for each one of those concepts. And if I were to sort of finish this diagram off and make it go towards pure black towards the center, what you can start to see is this is actually not a wheel anymore, but it's a cone, and the cone goes into the computer screen in depth. And that's going to become important as we look through some of the more complex color palettes as we move along. But I did want to point this out. But really a great way to understand tints and shades moving on is to understand one hue at a time. So I've pulled up this shape instead. It's a shape that you'll see if you work with Adobe software. Adobe Illustrator, Adobe Photoshop really represents hues this way, so you can be able to pick out tints and shades. And what we can see is when I actually pick out the color palette here, I did it the same way that I did before. I just used simple patterns. So to look at this palette that I have here, which is 3, essentially all it is red, pure red on one side. I have a pinkish color here, and I have a darker red color about in that location. We'll see if I get this right. And there we go. We can see that the pattern matches. This is a triangle of AAA. They're all 3 equal sides. That's simply how it is. Of course, there's other variations to this I'll just work through briefly here. So if I just step the screen one more time, we can look at 4 and just create a square. That would require me to sort of shift this color down here, shift this color up here, and of course add a new one down about there. Right, so for A, and A, just like in standard hues, they don't all have to be the same size. They can make a rectangle instead. So I could shift this guy over here. Actually, I have the answer already on the board. Don't even need this. And I could even rotate it. I don't even have to have it in that orientation. So I can sort of rotate them just like this and have an AB pattern. And the point being that monochromatic, just like the hues, is all based on very, very simple patterns that once you draw them on the board, they're really easy to understand. All right? So the point is, color theory is not mysterious. It is a collection of simple patterns. All right? So I want to show this palette, which is something I created. It's a pattern that you won't see in traditional harmony rules, but one that just plays off the same thing. We can see AB pattern. Now we notice that the A's and the B's, they look different lengths. This A looks shorter than that length. But the thing we have to remember is that this is not a flat object anymore. It's a cone going into the screen. And due to perspective, this length A is the same as that length A. The other thing you'll notice about this, which is really important besides that patterns, is that it's more sophisticated than what you often get from simple color theory. And yet it's completely understandable. It's just as easy to understand as before. Now, I'm going to go into another video on how you really create these and how to leverage these points, but this is just to show what you can get there once you understand these patterns. And I just want to end on this beautiful picture here, and I want to thank Shan Yu allowing me to use this picture. And I think the point is when we go and understand color theory, we were looking at a lot of color wheels, but let's not forget the ultimate point is to really be able to apply them to projects. And this is a great little village here using a variety of colors, and this community could work together to make it work. So we'll take another look in more depth in follow-up videos, but until those are posted, keep making great designs and keep making great drawings. Thanks for watching.